Now, in other news, the Albanese government has set up a national productivity fund, which means the states and territories will have to compete for money for plans to boost productivity growth. $900 million is up for grabs for things like planning and zoning reform. Here's the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers.
We're not seeking productivity growth at the cost of higher unemployment or by insisting Australians work longer for less. We're trying to apply new thinking to the challenge by broadening our ambitions beyond the tired old slogans on debates central to industrial relations.
Daniel, one of the biggest problems we're facing as a country right now is slow productivity growth. A lot of what you see in terms of employment, increasing employment, is in the care sector, which happens to be largely funded by the federal government through the NDIS. Is this $900 million actually going to change anything?
So the first thing I'd say is that, look, productivity growth has become harder right around the world in advanced economies. And I think there's a Martin Wolf article in the Financial Times today which goes to the heart of this, which is that productivity growth in the services sector is harder to achieve than in manufacturing and agriculture. And that's something we've seen over decades. So it's not a surprise that that's something we're seeing here. The second point is I think these payments could make a huge difference and they're really worth exploring. When you go back to the Fred Hilmer reforms in the 1980s and 1990s, when you look at the report that Ian Harbour handed down to the previous government on competition, incentive payments to the states were central to both of those approaches. This is something which I think we can probably get bipartisan support on. It's important for two reasons. Firstly, it incentivises states, and secondly, it recognises the fact that a lot of the hard lifting in terms of policy change that's required is going to have to be undertaken by state governments, and yet a lot of the increases in revenue through income tax and corporate tax will go to the Commonwealth government. So it's only fair that the Commonwealth government should pass on some of that benefit. So I think this is very sensible, and I think it will help.
Well, if we want to have that discussion about money going to the Commonwealth government, we could always go back to the pre-war setup where the states had control of income tax, but that's a discussion for another day. But Keith, I don't quite understand why we, the taxpayer, need to pay the states to reform things like their planning systems. Shouldn't they just be doing that anyway?
Well, no matter what the question is, Labor's answer is always spend more taxpayers' money. And I can tell you where productivity can be improved, and that is in policy settings from the Cabinet of the Australian Government. You don't need to spend enormous amounts of money to fix this. You need to stop doing things like sending our industrial relations programs back to the 1970s. We've got interest rates which have had 12 increases. We've got electricity and gas costs out of control. It makes people uncompetitive. The fundamentals of business don't change. For them to be successful, they have to be competitive internationally if they're looking to export. And we have a government that is hell-bent on giving the unions everything that they want, spending more taxpayer money, which is driving up inflation, and the RBA themselves have said this is an issue. And yet here we go, there's another $900 million for the states. Who'd have thought it?
Now, the PM doesn't seem to think it's worth catching up with Donald Trump before he becomes the US president again. Albanese's knocked back the suggestion from the opposition that he had a stop in Florida to see Trump on his way to the APEC leaders' meetings in Rio de Janeiro this week. Daniel, ought he, I know he's had a phone call, but ought he actually have a face-to-face discussion? I don't think there'd be any harm in it, would there?
Well, look, I think it's interesting that some of the people calling for this have also been the same people who roundly criticised the PM for travelling too much. So there's a bit of interest there.
It's a bit late for that.
Brazenly self-promoting here. I'm just in the process of finishing up a book on PM-President relations back to Federation, and I've actually interviewed all former PMs on their relations with presidents, including Turnbull and Morrison's relations with
You've got too much time
Trump.
in your hands.
And my lessons from that are that I think the way to succeed with Trump is going to be, firstly, to show him on each of the issues that comes up what's in it for the US, secondly, to be straightforward, and thirdly, to build trust. And so I think that's the approach we need to take. As issues come up, I think we need to approach it in that way, and I think we'll do very well. He's very open-minded to dealing with Australia in a positive way, I believe.